The silence in the house, after Eleanor was gone, was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a thick, felted thing that muffled the familiar creaks of the floorboards and absorbed the light from the windows. For 47 years, this house had been a duet. Her humming in the kitchen, a low counterpoint to the hiss of the kettle, the snip of her shears in the garden, a percussive rhythm against the drone of a summer bee. Now it was a solo, and I had forgotten the tune. My grief was a foreigner living in my own home, touching my things, sleeping in my bed, looking back at me from the bathroom mirror with my own tired eyes. It was a state of being acted upon, a slow and steady erosion. Then came the phone calls. First Robert, then Catherine. Their voices were swaddled in the cotton wool of feigned concern, but the words themselves were sharp little stones. "Dad, you can't manage that big place alone. It's just not practical, Dad. The upkeep, the taxes, we've been talking to a realtor just to get a sense of the market. It's incredible what the neighborhood is worth now. You'd be set for life. A really nice condo." They spoke of my life as if it were a ledger to be balanced, a property to be liquidated. They saw the house not as a repository of memory. The pencil marks on the pantry doorframe tracking their heights, the worn spot on the arm of Eleanor's reading chair, the ghost of her rosemary scent clinging to the curtains. But as an asset, a number with a great many zeros. They were pruning a life that was not yet dead. My life, seeing only the value of the timber. I listened, said little, and felt the foundation of my own world begin to shift beneath my feet, a subsidence I had no tools to repair. A week after the funeral, I was dusting. It was an act of quiet rebellion against the entropy that had taken hold, a simple, methodical task. I ran the cloth over Eleanor's roll-top desk, a formidable piece of oak she had inherited from her grandfather, a man who believed in things that lasted. My fingers traced the familiar grain, the geography of her shared life. A small knot in the wood, just below the main writing surface, felt different. It was loose. I pressed it, gently at first, then with more purpose. There was a soft, satisfying click, and a thin panel beneath the inkwell drawer dropped open, revealing a cavity I never knew existed. Inside was a single, thick manila folder, heavy as a brick. On the front, in her elegant forward-slanting script, was my name. Arthur. Just that. I carried it to the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly. The silence in the house seemed to lean in, to hold its breath. I sat in my usual chair, the one with the view of the garden, of her wilting rose bushes. Paperwork is not company, but it is companionship of a kind. This folder felt like her hand on my shoulder. I untied the string and opened it. On top was a letter several pages long, written on her favorite cream-colored stationery. The first line was a key turning a lock I hadn't known was rusted shut. "My dearest Arthur," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and our children are beginning to circle." I read on, the words blurring and sharpening with my tears. Eleanor, my quiet, gentle Eleanor, had seen it all. She had seen the transactional gleam in our children's eyes long before I had. She had understood their love was conditional, tied to the inheritance they felt was their due. She wrote not with anger, but with a profound, sorrowful clarity. She had spent the last 2 years of her life, while the illness quietly claimed her, building a fortress for me, not of brick and mortar, but of paper and law. Inside the folder was the evidence of her silent, meticulous work. There were statements for a bank account in Zurich, funded by a small inheritance she had never told me about. There were deeds, not for a condo, but for a small, whitewashed house with a lemon grove, overlooking the sea in a village on the coast of Portugal. A place we had visited once, long ago, a place she had apparently never forgotten. And there were instructions. Names of lawyers, contacts, step-by-step guides for transferring assets, for securing my independence. She had built an ark. She was telling me, from across the great, silent ocean of death, that it was time to gather the animals and close the door before the rains began. The grief in my chest did not shrink, but it changed its shape. It was no longer a formless, suffocating fog. It was becoming a ballast, a weight that gave me stability. A purpose. Revenge is not an explosion. It's a thermostat. You set it to a specific temperature, and you let it do its work, quietly, efficiently, until the climate in the room has changed completely. The next morning, I called the number for the lawyer listed in Eleanor's letter. Mr. Davison. His voice was like old leather, dry and reassuring. I explained who I was. There was no surprise in his tone. "Ah, Mr. Miller, I've been expecting your call. Your wife was a most remarkable and far-sighted woman. I have a file here for you. When would it be convenient for you to come in?" He was not a shark. He was a stonemason, ready to help me reinforce my walls. I met with him 2 days later. His office was filled with books, not screens. He walked me through the labyrinth Eleanor had constructed. The house, our house, was in an irrevocable trust. I was the sole trustee and beneficiary. It could not be sold without my express consent, and upon my death, it was to be managed by a historical preservation society she had already endowed. My children were beneficiaries of a separate, modest monetary trust, payable only upon my passing. They had been provided for, but they had been surgically excised from the house. They had no legal claim, no leverage. Mr. Davison looked at me over his spectacles. "Your wife, Mr. Miller, has given you a shield. My job is to help you learn how to use it." We drafted the first letters that day. Not to my children, but to the real estate agent who had been calling me, to the bank manager Robert had helpfully offered to speak with. They were crisp, formal notices. A notice of sole legal authority. A cease and desist. We were cutting their supply lines. Some victories are loud. Mine would not be. It would be the quiet click of locks falling into place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Next, I dialed the international number for the contact in Portugal. A woman answered, her voice warm, with an accent like baked earth and sunshine. "Sophia." I introduced myself. "Ah, Senhor Miller. Eleanor. She tell me you call one day. The house. She is ready for you. The lemons are heavy on the branches." I have been airing the rooms. It was real. It wasn't just paper in a folder. It was a place. A promise. I could smell the salt and the citrus over the phone line, a scent from a future I hadn't known I had. My final preparation was small, but crucial. I drove to the post office in the next town over and rented a private box. I opened a new bank account at a small, local credit union, using the P.O. box as my mailing address, and initiated the transfer of funds from the Zurich account as Eleanor had instructed. I was building a second, hidden life, parallel to the one my children thought they were managing. It was a strange sort of freedom, being invisible in plain sight. A week later, I made my first move. It was not an argument or a confrontation. It was an act of sanitation. I spent 2 days in the attic and the basement, sorting through decades of accumulated debris. Robert's football trophies, tarnished and dusty. Catherine's art projects from college, canvases warped with age. Yearbooks, participation ribbons, boxes of sentimental junk they had stored here and forgotten, assuming this house was not my home, but their personal free-of-charge storage unit. I packed it all. I labeled each box with a black marker. Then I called a moving company. The foreman was a young man with kind eyes. "Where's it all going, sir?" he asked. I handed him 2 addresses. "Half to this address in Northgate," I said, giving him Robert's. "And the other half here, in Westview, Catherine's. Bill it to me. Cash on delivery." It was a quiet declaration of independence. I was returning their baggage to them, both literally and metaphorically. This house would no longer be a museum of their childhoods. It was my home. The past was being evicted. The phone rang less than an hour after the first delivery. It was Robert, his voice a tight knot of fury and confusion. "Dad, what the hell is this?" A moving truck just dumped a mountain of boxes on my lawn. I let the silence hang for a moment before I answered, my voice calm, almost placid. "It's your things, son." I was cleaning out the attic, and I thought you'd want to have them, my things. "Dad, this is junk. My high school trophies? Why would you do this? Are you trying to send some kind of message?" "The only message is that I'm cleaning the house," I said simply. "I assumed you valued those memories." Catherine's call came an hour after his. She was more theatrical, her voice laced with wounded drama. "I don't understand, Daddy. It feels so aggressive. It feels like you're pushing us away. After all we're trying to do for you, I appreciate your concern, Catherine, I said, the words feeling smooth and polished like stones from a riverbed. I'm just tidying up. The house needed it. They couldn't comprehend it. In their world, actions were either transactions or aggressions. The simple, honest act of a man reclaiming his own space was an alien concept. They saw it as a move in a game they had invented, and it confused and angered them that I was no longer playing by their rules. The thermostat was working. The climate in the room was beginning to change. They demanded a meeting. We need to talk, Dad. All of us. Face to face. This is getting out of hand, I agreed. A gardener knows you cannot let weeds grow unchecked. Sometimes you must pull them up by the roots. But you do on your own terms. Of course, I said. Come on Sunday, 4 o'clock. Here at the house, I added, as if it were an afterthought. My lawyer, Mr. Davison, will be joining us. Just to make sure we have all the legal particulars straight. I find it so hard to keep track of these things anymore. The silence on the other end of the line was a small, satisfying victory in itself. Sunday arrived, a cool, overcast afternoon. I spent the morning in the garden, trimming Eleanor's roses, my hands in the familiar soil. When the doorbell rang at precisely 4, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in months. Mr. Davison was already with me, sitting in Eleanor's reading chair, a thin leather folio on his lap. I opened the door. Robert and Catherine stood on the porch, their faces set like concrete. They looked like a delegation arriving to negotiate a surrender. My surrender. We sat in the living room, a space that suddenly felt like a boardroom. They launched into their prepared speeches, a tag team of condescending solicitude. They spoke of my grief-induced confusion, my uncharacteristic behavior. They used words like vulnerable and isolated. Robert, ever the pragmatist, brought up the idea of a conservatorship. It's not what we want, Dad, but we have to consider what's best for you, for the estate. Not my life, the estate. I let them finish. I let the silence settle in the room once more, that thick, felted silence. Then I nodded to Mr. Davison. He didn't make a speech. He simply opened his folio and, in his dry, methodical voice, explained the legal reality of the situation. He outlined the terms of the irrevocable trust that held the house. He detailed the separate trust established for them. He informed them of the legal notices that had already been served to every third party they had contacted. He built a wall of fact around me, brick by legal brick, until they were left on the outside, looking in. Their faces shifted from concern to disbelief, then to raw, unveiled anger. You did this behind our backs. Catherine hissed, her voice trembling. Mother did this. Your mother was a wise woman, I said softly. She wanted to ensure I was cared for, without being managed. This is about money, Robert snapped, his composure finally cracking. You're being selfish, Dad. You're sitting on a gold mine while we're trying to build our own lives, trying to provide for our own kids. And there it was, the heart of it, the transactional core. My home was their future windfall, and I was merely the inconvenient tenant whose lease was taking too long to expire. It was then I knew it was time for the final move. The moral checkmate Eleanor had prepared for me. Speaking of your children, I said, reaching for the telephone on the end table. Let's talk about providing for them. I dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a bright, young voice answered. Hi, Grandpa. Hello, Lucy, my dear, I said, my voice warm and genuine. I pressed the speakerphone button. The sound of my granddaughter's voice filled the tense room. I have a question for you, sweetheart. Do you remember that savings bond your grandmother bought you for your 18th birthday? For your art school tuition? There was a pause. I could feel Robert's stare burning into the side of my head. Yes, Grandpa, Lucy said, her voice hesitant now. What about it? I was just going through some of your grandmother's papers, and it seems it was cashed in about 6 months ago. I hope you got all safely. The silence that followed was immense. It was a vacuum that pulled all the air and anger out of the room. I saw Catherine's eyes dart toward her brother. I saw the color drain from Robert's face. No, Grandpa, Lucy said finally, her voice small, confused. Dad said it was part of Grandma's estate, and it was all tied up in probate. He said it would take a year or 2 to get it. He gave me some money for my supplies. He said it was an advance. I looked at Robert. His mask of filial concern had crumbled, revealing the petty, grasping greed beneath. He had stolen from his own daughter, using his mother's death as a cover. Eleanor had known. Her letter had mentioned a suspicion about the bond, a final piece of ammunition she had left for me, just in case. I see, I said into the phone, my voice gentle. Don't you worry about it, Lucy. We'll get it sorted out. I'll call you back later, my dear. I love you too, Grandpa. I hung up the phone and placed it back in its cradle. The click was the sound of a guillotine blade falling. The argument was over. The moral high ground they had claimed had just washed away in a flood of their own making. I stood up. The meeting is over, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. Here are my terms. This house is not for sale. It will never be for sale. I will live here or wherever else I choose for the remainder of my life, as I see fit. Any future relationship we have will be on this foundation of truth. You will return Lucy's money in full, with interest, by the end of the month. Now, I believe you know the way out. They left without another word, their defeat clinging to them like a shroud. For the first time since Eleanor died, I felt the air in my own home lighten. I had not won a battle. I had simply restored the peace. 2 weeks later, my departure was a quiet affair. No grand farewells. I packed 2 suitcases with clothes, a few books, and a framed photo of Eleanor from my bedside table. I left a short, simple note on the kitchen table for the woman who came to clean. I walked through the garden one last time, my fingers brushing against the silvery leaves of the rosemary bush. I took a single sprig with me. The taxi was waiting. At the airport, I bought a one-way ticket. Landing in Lisbon was like stepping into a different color palette. The light was golden, the sky a richer blue. Sophia was there to meet me, a sturdy woman with a smile that reached her eyes. She drove me the hour south to the small village, chattering in warm, melodic English about the local market, the best place for coffee, the stubbornness of her goat. The car smelled of oranges. When we pulled up to the house, I understood. It was simple, whitewashed, with a blue door and terracotta tiles. It sat on a small hill, and below it, the lemon grove tumbled down towards a glittering expanse of the Atlantic. It was not a mansion. It was a haven. Sophia handed me a heavy iron key. Eleanor, she choose well, she said, patting my arm. Welcome home, Senor Miller. The house was clean, airy, and filled with a gentle, dappled light. It smelled of lemon polish and sea salt. It was furnished simply but comfortably. On the kitchen table was a loaf of fresh bread, a wedge of cheese, and a bottle of wine. A new life. I walked out onto the small terrace. The scent of the lemon blossoms was intoxicating. I looked out at the sea, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel like a presence of loss. It felt like an invitation. I disconnected my old phone number that night. I let the noise of the old world fade away. A year passed, a year of sun and soil, of learning the rhythms of a new place. A year of healing. I learned the names of the local fishermen. I learned to bake bread. I planted a small rosemary bush by the door. My grief had not vanished, but it found its place. It was a part of the landscape of my heart now, a gentle valley, not a jagged peak. Lucy came to visit that spring. She had blossomed. Her art was flourishing. We sat on the terrace, drinking fresh lemonade, and she told me about her classes, her friends, her dreams. She looked at me, her eyes clear and perceptive, so much like her grandmother's. You seem happy here, Grandpa, she said. I am, my dear, I said. I am. Later that week, I took her to a small cafe in the village and told her everything. I told her about the other trust, the one Eleanor and I had established just for her, untouched and untainted. I gave her the documents, signed and notarized by a local lawyer. This isn't an inheritance, Lucy, I told her, placing my hand over hers. It's a foundation. Your grandmother wanted you to have the tools to build your own life, beholden to no one. Use it to create, to learn, to be brave. I then gave her a sealed envelope. On the front, in Eleanor's hand, it said, For Lucy. When the time is right, she opened it carefully. I watched as she read her grandmother's final words, the wisdom passed down from one generation to the next. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. The legacy was secure. It was not in a house or a bank account. It was in her. My children and I had found a new, carefully defined equilibrium. They sent stilted emails. I replied with polite, brief updates. They had apologized, a clumsy, half-hearted attempt, which I had accepted in the way one accepts a cloudy day. It simply is what it is. I told them they could visit if they wished. Once a year, on the last Sunday in September. For pie. Reconciliation, but on my terms, on my soil. My final arrangements were made. My renewal was clear. The house in Portugal would go to Lucy. The old house, the house of my life with Eleanor, was now fully endowed. Upon my death, the Historical Society would take over its preservation, turning the ground floor into a small community library and maintaining the garden as a public space. A place of quiet contemplation. Its value was now memory. Its purpose was peace. It could never be sold. It could never be turned into a number on a ledger. That evening, Lucy and I walked in the lemon grove as the sun set, turning the sea to liquid gold. We found a small, empty patch of earth near the house. I took a small trowel and dug a hole. I handed her the rosemary sapling I had been cultivating from the sprig I'd brought with me. Together, we placed it in the ground, packing the dark, rich soil around its roots. A piece of the old world planted in the new. A life beginning again.